Now we would like to start the technology session 4, negative emission technologies. First, I would like to introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. David Sandalo. Mr. David Sandalo is an Innovation for Cool Earth Forum Steering Committee member, the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and co-director of Energy and Environment Concentration at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. The speakers for this session are Dr. S. Julio Friedman, Senior Research Scholar, Center for Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Dr. Sugiyama Masahiro, Associate Professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. Dr. Shuchi Talati, Chief of Staff, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, U.S. Department of Energy. Dr. Akimoto Keigo, Group Leader of Systems Analysis Group, Chief Researcher, Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth. And now we'd like to inform you that Dr. Talati has contributed a video presentation for the session, but will not participate in the discussion. So I would like to ask Mr. Sandalo to moderate this session. Mr. Sandalo, if you please.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our session on negative emissions technologies, one of the most important topics when it comes to fighting climate change. I just want to start with some basic observations. First, perhaps the most basic. The concentration of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere today is higher than at any time in human history, and it's continuing to climb. Dozens of countries representing more than 70% of global emissions have now made net zero pledges, and hundreds, if not thousands, of companies have done the same. That's the good news. However, the path to achieving those net zero pledges is uncertain at best. We've seen steep declines in the cost of renewable power and energy storage. That offers hope for decarbonizing the global power sector. But pathways for decarbonizing other sectors, including industry, aviation, and agriculture, are far less clear. And critically for this session, falling emissions will not be enough. For the world to achieve its climate goals, significant volumes of carbon dioxide must be removed from the atmosphere as well. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is crystal clear on this. It stated in its 1.5 degree report as follows, and I quote, "All pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the 21st century. Approaches such as direct air capture, biomass carbon removal and storage, and afforestation will be essential in order to achieve what the IPCC says we must do." Negative emissions technologies are not just the topic of this session. They've also been the topic of a number of recent roadmaps produced by ICEF. And one of our first speaker is a co-author on several of those. I highly commend to you, if you're interested in this topic, going to the ICEF roadmap portion of the ICEF website, and you can find our roadmaps on direct air capture, on biomass carbon removal and storage, and a roadmap that we're releasing today on carbon mineralization. And so with that, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to one of the leading experts in the world on these topics, my friend and colleague at Columbia University, Dr. Julio Friedman.
Thank you so much. It is a delight to be here. I believe we pivot to my presentation now. Yes? Good.
Hello there. I'm glad to be here with ICEF. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about negative emissions, technology, and how it will scale and how rapidly it must scale. The reason why? We have basically failed. This is what California looked like last year. Fundamentally, we are failing and we are out of time And the core arithmetic of net zero is harsh and unforgiving. It says to achieve net zero stabilization anywhere, we must unemit or remove any emissions anywhere globally. That is a very difficult thing to do. Today, we emit 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year, and in order to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must get to zero in the next 30 years. That is really, really hard. Part of the reason why is because even if we zeroed out all of the emissions from energy use, about 25% still remain. There is an irreducible emissions fraction that is very hard to get. It is also the case that we have never used less of any kind of energy, and removing these emissions and reducing these emissions is extremely difficult. So if we fail at that part, if we fail to reduce the energy emissions, we will have more emissions to remove. That is what is meant by net zero. CO2 removal is now projected to become the world's biggest market as a consequence. The IPCC has said that unequivocally CO2 removal will be needed to achieve a 1.5 degree target. This means on the order of 5 to 10 billion tons of CO2 removal every year. That will end up being the world's biggest market. That is on top of the 30 or 40 billion tons a year of abatement we will get from reduced emissions. We must also have the removed emissions. To understand the scale of this, 10 gigatons is twice the size of today's oil and gas industry. So, no happy talk. We have to be serious about what this means. Thankfully, there are a wide array of things that one can do. One can use nature-based solutions, like adding forests or putting carbon into soil. It is also possible to use purely engineered systems, like direct air capture or enhanced alkalinity of the oceans. It is also possible to accelerate natural processes, for example, mineralizing rocks and turning carbon dioxide to stone, or combining bioenergy systems with carbon capture and geological storage. Thankfully, already a number of companies are purchasing these services, and there are policies in the United States and elsewhere that are accelerating this transition. I will talk briefly just about two of these technologies, carbon mineralization and direct air capture. Carbon mineralization is a natural process. The Earth turns CO2 to stone over time. In some places, like in Oman, this happens very quickly. A number of companies have emerged that are trying to do this at a faster, larger scale. One of these is called 4401. They are trying to mineralize CO2 in the Omani ophiolite deposits and basically move large volumes of carbon dioxide through these rock bodies. There's another company that's trying a very different approach, Heirloom. Their approach is the opposite. Crush the rocks, distribute them widely, and get the air to contact it that way. I have been pleased to see rapid progress with these companies, and both have been getting notice and investment. You may also be familiar with direct air capture. This is a picture of the largest direct air capture plant on the world, Orca. It is 4,000 tons per year. Here in Reykjavik, this combines direct air capture with mineralization. This is what it looks like up close. This does the work of 200,000 trees with 1,000 times less space. It is very intense and very concentrated and can move large volumes quickly. The largest proposed plant is this one here by Carbon Engineering. This one will be much, much larger, 1 million tons per year, combined with a mixture of enhanced oil recovery and saline formation storage. Today, the cost for these technologies is quite high, but we have already seen dramatic cost reductions and expect that through deployment we will get larger cost reductions quickly. Importantly, if we get these technologies to scale and we get the costs down, they will save trillions of dollars every year trillions of dollars every year on the cost of global abatement. Thankfully, we are seeing companies proceeding in the voluntary market to do that. Tech companies, airline companies, financial companies have done this, and in fact, private citizens. Ultimately, though, we will have to replace a voluntary market with a compliance market and make these things mandatory as part of a climate framework. In this context, it is not too expensive. The yellow bar here shows the cost of direct air capture at the million-ton scale, and it is already cheaper than many policies we have today. It is also the case that on $1 per ton of abatement, it is cheaper than sustainable aviation fuels. This is work that we've done at Columbia University. Ultimately, though, this will need new policies if we are going to scale. And thankfully, we have many of these policies coming forward because the politics are changing quickly. There is nonlinear, dynamic politics, both pro and against. However, the existence of the technology and the opportunity to scale is new, profound, and welcome. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. And now we will turn to presentation by Dr. Masa Sugiyama of the University of Tokyo.
I would like to thank this session chair and the organizer of ICEF. Today, I would like to talk about direct air carbon capture and storage, DACCS or DACS, and its challenges for upscaling. DAC stands for direct air capture. It's a chemical engineering method to directly capture atmospheric carbon dioxide. If you combine that with storage, it is called direct air carbon capture and storage, or DACS, and it can act as carbon dioxide removal, CDR, or negative emissions technology. Of course, you don't have to store captured carbon dioxide underground. You can use it to produce synthetic fuels, for instance. There are two main technologies currently being developed. The first one is liquid solution technologies. Carbon dioxide, if dissolved in water, it becomes a weak acid, so you can use an alkaline solution to capture carbon dioxide. But this technology requires high temperature. It's currently being developed by a company called Carbon Engineering based in Canada, and it now has a plan to develop 1 megaton CO2 capture per year. The plant will be developed in the Permian Basin in the United States. The second class is solid sorbent technologies. These technologies are based on solid sorbents like amine, and you use temperature or moisture or vacuum swing to regenerate solid sorbents. Only low temperature heat is sufficient, so this is actually one advantage. Requires absorbent, of course. One leading company is Climeworks, which is based in Switzerland, and it just completed a 4 kiloton carbon dioxide per year capture plant in Iceland. DACCS has some upsides. First, there is no significant inherent environmental side effect. Second, it has locational flexibility. You can build a plant in a desert to avoid NIMBY. If you look at the history of CCS carbon capture and storage, it has suffered from a lot of NIMBY problems. So DACCS could potentially avoid this problem. It has its own challenges. First, its cost is high. Its current cost is uncertain, but it is considered to be on the order of $600 per ton of CO2. The literature suggests it's going to decline down to $100 or $300 per ton of CO2, but it requires substantial innovation. It also requires a high energy, a lot of energy. Some suggest some calculations suggest at the 10 gigaton per year sequestration, the DAC plants require 40 to 100 exajoules per year. So it is significant. If DACCS is going to play a significant role in climate change mitigation, it has to be scaled up. Right now, maybe the scale is 10 kilotons of CO2 per year, or if the Permian Basin project is successful, then we can say it's on the order of megaton. But we need a gigaton scale DACCS. That is a lot. And if you do math, it requires a compound growth rate of 26%, 20%, 30% for 30 years. That's a long-term spectacular growth. So governments are now trying to help, and there are some niche markets. So there is actually a volunteer market, and you can buy captured CO2 from companies. And also the United States, it has a tax credit scheme, and California has low carbon fuel standard. All these are helpful. And this year, Elon Musk started an X Prize on direct air capture, which is all these are really great. But the challenge of upscaling is very big, and basically it's comparable to what we did with solar. Can we really repeat the success of solar? That's the key question we are facing now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sugiyama. And our next presentation is from Dr. Suchi Talati of the U.S. Department of Energy.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. My name is Dr. Suchi Talati, and I'm the Chief of Staff in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the United States Department of Energy. Many thanks to the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry and the New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization for giving me this opportunity to join you all. I'm excited to talk about the opportunities that the Biden administration sees for negative emissions technologies to help us get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The recent sixth assessment IPCC report formally underlined for the world that it is no longer enough to focus solely on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. We must also invest in carbon dioxide removal technologies that can permanently remove CO2 from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. Climate models clearly indicate that in order to meet our net zero goals, CDR technologies will need to be deployed at scale to address the hardest to decarbonize sectors, like agriculture, shipping, and aviation. This effort must be conducted in parallel with rapid mitigation and will require a thoughtful and robust strategy across industries and nations. From day one, the Biden administration committed to an all-of-government approach to tackling the climate crisis. To align with the administration's climate goals and tackle this emergency, the Office of Fossil Energy officially added carbon management to its name on July 4th, 2021. This is not simply a rebranding, it's a historical shift in focus. Specifically, it recognizes that in order to meet our climate goals, we have to decarbonize the energy and industrial sectors and manage the carbon that comes with the legacy of burning fossil fuels. And while the United States continues to rely on fossil fuels to meet increasing energy demands, it is critical that we minimize the environmental impact and decarbonize the existing infrastructure that will persist through mid-century, learning from and collaborating with our global partners, also confronting the energy transition. Importantly, when it comes to the deployment of CDR, central to the success of FECM's work within Biden administration is our refocused efforts to address the energy inequities that have plagued our country. We are dedicated to prioritizing environmental justice and equity to ensure that the energy transition does not disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities and brings the benefits of our investments to those who need it most. Investments like the historic bipartisan infrastructure package currently in the United States Congress includes commitments to expanded demonstration and deployment of negative emissions technologies, larger than ever before, and it's a critical step towards achieving our deep decarbonization goals. At FECM, we are dedicated to advancing these technologies. For example, we're investing in approaches that couple direct air capture to both low carbon energy sources and scalable use or storage to enable pathways towards use of CO2 in a product like concrete, where it can be durably stored or stored geologically deep underground. We are also aiming to expand carbon storage demonstration so that we have more projects available, distributed across the United States and in locations where CO2 injection deep underground is feasible. We are committed to working with our partners to advance negative emissions technologies, where global cooperation and partnerships are critical to moving this pace forward. We must ensure that we invest in these technologies to reach our global climate commitments. As you may know, Secretary Granholm announced at the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting in April that the Department of Energy will work with our global partners to launch a major mission innovation focused on CDR at COP26. This will be a multi-country effort focused on CDR R&D that will be the first of its kind for negative emissions technologies. Moving forward, we welcome the opportunity to engage in conversations like this one to further that effort and to help us ensure that Earth remains a livable home for today's climate vulnerable populations across the globe, in addition to our future generations. Thank you again for having me. I look forward to continuing this discussion with you all in the future.
And our final presentation is by Dr. Akimoto Keigo of the Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth in Tokyo.
My name is Keigo Akimoto from Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth. I'd like to talk about the role and the cost of negative emission technologies for carbon neutrality. So the Paris long-term goals request well below 2 degrees and to 1.5 degrees targets. Negative CO2 emissions will be necessary for achieving the Paris long-term targets by 2100. For the below 1.5 degrees, net zero CO2 emissions will be required by about 2050. Large amounts of negative emission technologies, nets, or in other words, carbon dioxide removal (CDR) technologies will be required by about 2050 at least. Several kinds of emission reduction pathways for the long-term Paris goals. Future technology and social changes are very uncertain, and we should have wide options, including energy saving, renewables, CCUS, and negative emission technologies in order to increase the achieving probability. The emission reduction scenarios by the integrated assessment models, IAMs, employed in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, SR15, have not considered direct air capture, DAC, but after the SR15, some studies by using some IAMs treat direct air capture within the models show that direct air CO2 capture and storage DACs will play a large role for the Paris long-term goals. For example, according to the merge ETL model, the economical deployments of direct air capture and storage are about 40 gigaton CO2 per year in 2100 for the 1.5 degrees target. In addition, according to the assessment by TIAM and WICH models for the 1.5 degrees target, the economical deployments of nets in 2100 are about 30 gigaton CO2 per year, which is the assumption of the maximum deployment level of direct air capture and storage in the models. Thanks to DACs, the marginal abatement cost can be greatly reduced. This slide shows the overview of the DACs. DAX requires large energy for capturing low density of CO2 in the air, but the required run is considerably low compared with BECCS. There are potential opportunity to deploy DAX with relatively low cost in the areas where have large CO2 storage potentials and low cost and large amounts of renewable energies. Let me show you the assessment of nets in Japan by using technology-rich global energy systems model DNA21+, developed by Light. This figure shows the GHG emissions by sector in Japan in 2050 for the 1.5 degrees scenario for the world and net zero GHG emission in 2050 in Japan. The great efforts reducing GHG emissions in several sectors are required. But nets such as DAX, BECCS, and forestation will contribute to offsetting the residual emissions of non-CO2 GHG, process CO2, and other energy-related CO2, and achieving the three target more economically. This is the total primary energy supply in Japan in 2050. Various options such as energy savings, renewable energies, CCS, hydrogen, ammonia, and synthetic fuels will be economical for achieving net zero emissions in Japan in 2050. Thanks to nets such as BECCS and DAX, fossil fuels without CCS can be used even under the net zero emission target. Next, let me show you the emission reductions potentials and costs in 2050 by sector and technology for Japan. Forestation and BECCS will be cheaper than DAX, but are constrained by the land available area. DAX will serve as a backstop technology even in Japan, but will have a dependency on CO2 storage potentials domestically and possibilities of transport to overseas. Finally, I'd like to talk about the global role of nets and show you global CO2 emissions by sector and the emission reduction cost in 2050. In our reference case, about 27 gigaton CO2 of nets will contribute to the achievement of global CO2 net zero emission. Technologies improvement levels in the future are very uncertain, but even under larger cost reductions in PV and wind power assumptions, about 25 gigaton CO2 of nets will contribute to the net zero emission. The cost reduction of DAC and availabilities of bioenergy are also uncertain. If these constraints are considered, the role of nets can be reduced to about 15 gigaton CO2 per year, but still large contributions can be estimated. Finally, if CO2 storage potentials are assumed to be constrained to be small, below 10 gigaton CO2, the CO2 marginal abatement costs are greatly increased and challenging to achieve global net zero emissions will be also greatly increased. Finally, let me conclude as follows. Various options such as energy saving, including social innovation, renewable energies, CCUS, hydrogen, ammonia, and synthetic fuels, will be important for achieving net zero emissions by 2050 in Japan. On the other hand, for net zero GHG emissions in Japan, Nets such as DECs and BECs will contribute to offsetting the residual emissions of non-CO2 GHGs, processed CO2, and other energy-related CO2, and will help achieve the target more economically. There are larger potentials of DECs and BECs with lower cost in the world than in Japan. The nets will play an important role to achieve global net zero emissions. Particularly, DECs can play a role as a backstop type technology and will also contribute to the whole management of climate change mitigation costs, including the cost targets of technology development. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers for those really interesting remarks. And maybe let's just start talking where Akimoto-san ended there, talking about Japan and Japan's role and what are the opportunities for negative emissions technologies in Japan. If I heard you, Akimoto-san, correctly, I think you were suggesting that maybe there are other places in the world that are better to do this than Japan, and Japanese capacity might be somewhat limited. And I wondered, one, did I hear you correctly? And then I was curious what Sugiyama-san thinks about this topic and what are the opportunities in Japan?
Thank you very much, David. As you said, CCS potentials of Japan is limited compared to the world, but also Japan has relatively large potentials of CO2 storage, and also we have an opportunity to transport to capture CO2 to overseas. And also in Japan, the cost of renewable energies, particularly wind power, solar PV, is relatively high compared to overseas. Under the conditions in Japan, we also need we need a lot of several types of technologies and measures. So the direct air capture and storage is also economical options, particularly for the carbon neutrality in 2050. So we have to have a lot of opportunities to develop several types of technologies, including direct air capture and storage. Thank you.
Thank you. Sugiyama-san, any thoughts on this topic?
So, thank you, Mr. Sandalo. So following up on Akimoto-san's point, I think so. We need, direct air capture, but I think, as I said in my presentation, there's a locational flexibility because the CO2 is a well-mixed greenhouse gas. It doesn't matter where you remove carbon dioxide, at least for the atmosphere. For economics or other reasons, it makes a difference, but from the atmospheric perspective, it doesn't make any difference. So, and I think because we have technical capabilities on the capture side, so if this is not direct air capture, but in the case of BECS, bioenergy with the carbon capture and storage, so there's a plant Drax in the United Kingdom, and for instance, Mitsubishi is a part of it. So I think we have other many different companies which have good technical capabilities. So we can go ahead and develop the capture aspect, but where should we bury it underground? I think that's a key question, and I think because of the locational flexibility, I can envision a scenario in which Japanese companies go to places like Middle East or maybe sunny, dry, like a desert-like areas, and build the air capture plants there and operate them. And of course, we have to do sort of agreement with the particular country that would host this facility. but then and it's it will be operated by Japanese companies, and Japan can take credit for it. And actually, this is complicated because it is related to, if I understand correctly, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and because it's an international transfer of mitigation outcome. I don't not sure if this is counted as mitigation, but basically it's a something like international transfer of credits or carbon removal. So we have time because we are now, I think we can start with the voluntary small markets, and I don't think we have to worry about these details right now. But as we move forward, I think there's a significant legal issue we will face. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Friedman, you and I have just released an ICEF roadmap on the topic of carbon mineralization, and anybody who wants to see it can go to the ICEF website and get a copy. It's a really, you mentioned it in your PowerPoint presentation, there's very little knowledge about this I found around the world. And I wondered, do you think there's opportunities in Japan that, may not be that widely understood or known to use carbon mineralization for negative emissions technologies?
Thank you. The answer is absolutely yes. Japan has extraordinary resources for carbon mineralization, and not just the general resources associated with basaltic rocks, but in particular, there are, in fact, high quality mineral deposits with a lot of easily reacted mineral classes like brucite, a lot of labile calcium, a lot of labile magnesium that will react with CO2 very quickly. Those minerals already have the thermodynamic energy in them necessary to do the work. So Japan looks like it is blessed with exceptional natural resource on this method of CO2 removal. I sincerely hope that Japan begins to further focus on and pioneer this technology and put some field tests into place to learn more about the opportunity.
And maybe say just another word for those people in the audience who may not be familiar with really what we're talking about here. What types of projects would these be? How could carbon mineralization help to sequester carbon in Japan?
Sure. So at the very highest level, carbon mineralization is very simple, and it's a natural reaction. CO2 in the air gets into rain, that makes carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid, when it rains down, reacts with minerals to make new minerals, calcium carbonates and magnesium carbonates and the like. What carbon mineralization is accelerating those reactions. Ideally, through finding abundant minerals locally where those reaction kinetics are already very fast and where the thermodynamics are favored. And if you can do this, the potential for abatement is enormous. One could remove gigatons of CO2 every year, and the Earth's crust has so abundant minerals, we are effectively unlimited by how much CO2 could be removed. What I find vexing about this discussion is almost nobody knows what I just said. There's very little understanding in policy circles or in industrial circles about this opportunity. Thankfully, not only is METI looking at this, but companies like Mitsubishi are also looking at this. Mining companies like Rio Tinto and De Beers are looking at this. It is starting to enter the consciousness of policymakers, CEOs, and investors. I hope we'll see this opportunity grow. We can't hear you, David. I'm sorry, you muted yourself.
I'm sorry. I'm sitting in New York City where sirens come by my apartment very frequently, and there were loud sirens, and I just muted, and then I forgot to turn it off. I hope the roadmap that we're releasing in connection with the ICEF conference today can help contribute to what Dr. Friedman is talking about, greater understanding of these opportunities, not just in Japan, but all around the world. There's lots of opportunities all around the world. We have a number of interesting questions from the audience. One audience member asked about the target cost of negative emissions technologies in 2050. where should we hope? Where should we aim for? Is there a target cost? You know, what should we be shooting for?
So, if I may, we know that the cost of direct air capture technology will be the most expensive of these options. We also know that within, say, 10 or 20 years, the cost will drop dramatically. I believe that by 2030, we will be below $300 a ton and probably lower. I believe that by 2040, we are highly likely to be below $200 a ton. And that would be the most expensive of the net technologies. The others will be cheaper still, like biohydrogen with CCS or mineralization are likely to be much cheaper. I don't like the framing, though, of a target cost per se. Instead, I think about the fact that every time we reduce the cost of this, the cost of saving the Earth gets lower. And the amount of money that we save on integrated abatement drops. If direct air capture costs $300 a ton, global abatement costs $3 trillion less every year. If we drop it to $200 a ton, we save $5 trillion in costs every year, and so forth. So the idea is not a target cost, but just as low as possible, as fast as possible, and that makes it cheaper to save the planet.
Akimoto-san, I thought I saw you nodding your head. Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, according to the IPCC SR15, the emission reduction, marginal emission reduction cost, carbon price will be about 700 to 4,000 dollar per ton CO2 for 1.5 targets. So the carbon price is very high for the carbon neutrality by 2050. Under such a target, deep emission targets, direct air capture's costs target direct air capture and storage is cost effective even for the current, even under the current cost for about $700 per ton CO2. But I expect to the cost reductions of DEX to be about 200 or $300 per ton CO2 by 2050. These are the reasonable cost target for direct air capture and storage, and it's a large contribution to the carbon neutrality by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience on the topic of trees. And this audience member says the trees are an important carbon dioxide removal technology, and asked generally about forests and how we should think about forest growth and growing trees as CDR. Anyone have thoughts on that topic?
So there's a lot of work going on trying to enhance trees and how they operate. Let me start by saying that investing in trees is smart and good. As many people say, trees provide additional benefits as well as being cheap and actionable today. But it is also the case that we know that the ability of trees to contribute to CO2 removal is limited. It is limited by core nutrients. For every 116 carbon atoms, you need 15 nitrogen atoms, you need 1 phosphorus atoms. Making a larger leaf doesn't fix that problem. Like that's the basic biology of plants. We have learned that changing the genome of plants to make things like deeper roots or roots with different substance is much harder than people originally thought. And at the end of the days, trees still burn. Trees need water. Trees need land. And so there are trade-offs as we get to very large CO2 removal volumes with trees. That is not a knock on trees. We want them, we need them, we should do as much as we can. But already the national academies, the Royal Academies, the IPCC all reach the same conclusion. If you maximize everything we can do on trees, it's still not enough. We still need engineered solutions. And according to the National Academies of Sciences in the US, at best, trees can get us maybe 25% of the removal that we need. The other 75% are going to have to come from engineered solutions.
Was that a global figure, Julio, or
Yes, that is a global figure.
Oh.
Conveniently, it is also the US figure, but yes, that is a global figure.
Sugiyama-san, do you agree with this, or any thoughts on the role of trees?
So I'd like to say something a little bit different, but it's still related to trees. So if you look at the cost of planting trees, of course it's cheap. So Dr. Friedman said that direct capture is the most expensive, which is true. And so among many other CDR or negative emission options, yeah, planting trees is considered to be cheap. But like he said, it's there's a possibility of a wildfire, and also there's once the trees stop growing, there's no longer CDR or photosynthesis. So I mean, photosynthesis going, but I mean, there's no carbon uptake. So so because of that, I think sometimes we forget, but the mitigation is the first priority. Emissions reduction is the priority. Why we are interested in CDR or negative emission is reducing emission is not enough, and it's not going to be. I mean, even if you have very cheap CDR options, it wouldn't remove the need to reduce emissions. And so what we have been talking so far is on top of mitigation, we need lots of CDR. I hope the audience wouldn't misunderstand our message. So I just wanted to say that. And there's a technical term to describe, the reduced interest from the interest in CDR. Like, people have talked about mitigation deterrence or moral hazard, and we should avoid that. And even some governments started advocating for separating the mitigation, so emission reduction targets from CDR targets. And I think that's the right way to go. So CDR is going to be important, but it supplements mitigation, and it wouldn't replace the role of reducing emissions.
This gets into some important kind of social and political issues. You just point, to the concern that some people have voiced about mitigation deterrence, as you say. And I think what that means is that there's some people who are concerned that if we invest in carbon dioxide removal, that we will slow down the reduction of emissions. I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I find that argument to be strange. That's like saying because Diet Coke exists, nobody can lose weight. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I do think that fundamentally, this issue is entirely up to us. It is entirely up to us. We control whether or not that happens. If people are worried about that, okay, well, you make policies and laws that do that. It's not that hard, actually. And you can say, like Sugiyama-san was just discussing, you can say, well, we must do reduction. We will mandate reduction targets, we will mandate reduction outcomes, and we will also support removal on top of that. And in fact, most corporations who are serious about climate have begun to do that themselves. They have made strong reduction commitments. They've made those reduction commitments for 2025 and 2030. And then they have added removal commitments on top of that. And that kind of example is a good example for governments to follow. So people can be worried all they like, but you can be worried or you can stand up and do something. And I'm pleased that people are generally starting to do something along these lines.
Julio, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Friedman. Yes, we need, it's solvable, and we need these clever and smart policies and actions from both the governments and the companies. And there's actually a talk of anti-moral hazard. If we start talking about the need for removal and even solar geoengineering, people get more worried about the climate change. I didn't know that it's climate crisis is so dire. That could be the message. So I think we could use the notion of CDR, negative emissions, to motivate the people to do more.
That's a very interesting idea, Sugiyama-san. On the subject of policy, there's been a lot of dialogue in Washington, D.C. about carbon dioxide removal, and I think it might be interesting to an international audience what the latest is with respect to US legislation on this topic, because it could be very high impact. I know, Dr. Friedman, you've been talking to people in Washington about this. Could you just kind of briefing about where we are? Is one, is this legislation going to pass? And two, what's it going to say if it does pass?
Boy, I really wish I could answer the question if it going to pass or not. Right now, I think it's going to pass. It seems likely to pass, but what exactly passes is still being negotiated even as we speak. Still, there are a number of provisions for CO2 removal that I think are very interesting. In the infrastructure bill, there are $3.5 billion of grant money for direct air capture hubs. That would go a long way towards helping things out. Most importantly, it would get us on the order of 3 or 4 plants, which would make it de-risked for capital markets. There is a substantial increase in the carbon capture tax credit specifically for direct air capture. And the current legislation proposals that I've seen are as high as $180 a ton, which is at that point becoming important for a business model. There's also, however, provisions for reforestation run through the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture. There are provisions for soil carbon increases through the Department of Agriculture, for CO2 pipeline financing and loans that would go through the Department of Transportation. I'm pleased to see that we are seeing something that looks like an all-of-government approach. And it is my sincere hope that that would make it possible for an acceleration of many of these opportunities. Last but not least, there's a lot of money for demonstrations going through the Department of Energy. And that includes demonstrations for things like mineralization, bioenergy with CCS, and direct air capture.
And I'll just add that Dr. Friedman and I were co-authors of a book that was released last year on this topic called Energizing America, which talks about many of these ideas. And we're really thrilled that today we are releasing this book in Japanese for anybody who's interested. And you can go to our website at Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy there to get a copy of the Japanese language version of our book talking about all these topics, and it'll be on the ICEF, the link will be on the ICEF website as well. We have a question from the audience about how to deploy more CCS around the world. That seems very relevant to the cost discussion that several of you raised as well. Any thoughts about how we grow the number of CCS projects around the world? Yes, Akimoto-san.
Demonstration of the CCS is very important to reduce investment risks by particularly by private companies. CCS cost is relatively economically compared to the, for example, under the carbon price of 50 or 60 euro per ton CO2, or current price of EU ETS, but CCS is not so large deployment so far. This is because the investment risks by the private companies. So we need to reduce the investment risk of CCS. So demonstration is also important, and also stable carbon price is important. Volatility of the carbon price of if we have a large volatility of carbon prices, private companies will not invest a large amount of CCS project. So stable carbon price and stable climate policies will be also very important.
I have one very brief thing to add to that. In most parts of the world, there is not infrastructure for carbon capture and storage projects. We need pipelines, we need industrial hubs, we need storage sites. That's part of the infrastructure. And this makes it different than a typical electricity supply. We need additional specific infrastructure. Europe seems to be heading in that direction. They seem to be going towards hubs and clusters. The United States is creating policies to add more pipelines. I sincerely hope that will help us get more projects.
May I add to that?
Please.
I think there's another aspect which is a public perception, and I think this is not applicable to not only CCS or CDR in general. Yes, Dr. Friedman, so EU and the United States, they are making the smart decisions and smart policies. But looking at what's happening in Japan, I think there's a lot of potential sort of a local opposition to the notion of a CCS, and it's not going as rapidly as we wish. And actually, that's one of the reasons why some scenarios from Japan assume that the export of CCS to foreign storage sites, because it's quite tricky for us to come up with a specific storage sites within the territory of Japan. And this is actually related to the high population density of Japan. It's hard. I mean, of course, we have storage sites, but relative to the number of people living, it's a bit hard. And I think, yes, I why I particularly appreciate direct air capture is the locational flexibility. We don't have to worry about, we can avoid, if we do it in a clever manner, smart way, we can avoid the NIMBY problem or public perception issues quite a bit. And I think so, Dr. Friedman, I agree. I have not read your report on mineralization or enhanced weathering or the new approach, but I personally I feel it's a bit difficult for us to deploy mineralization at a large scale without any perception problem. So I think that's because I do perception studies by myself. I think that's I take it as another research topic for myself. Thank
you. Any thoughts on that, Julio, on the perception issues?
I think that we have to be serious about societal response and public perception. I think there's also not one public, and I think there's not one perception. It can vary quite a lot even within a country like Japan. It can vary quite a lot around the world within a country like the United States, or even within a state like California. The acceptance and level of public interest can vary profoundly in very short distances. So I think you have to take what Sugiyama-san says very seriously, but I do think it's resolvable. And it is just another problem to be faced and another problem to be overcome.
Well, great. Well, we are just about out of time. We have one last question from the audience. I think it's quick, and Dr. Friedman, you could answer it. To please share the range of costs related to CO2 mineralization. And then any closing thoughts.
So first, on that question, the range of costs is not helpful. The current estimates range from $10 to $1,000 a ton. And that's because you're actually dealing with many different kinds of processes, many different kinds of mineral classes. It's not really one thing. Carbon mineralization is 8 or 9 different things. And so the cost for mineralizing steel slag is quite different than the cost of grinding and processing basalt. But in point of fact, all of those costs will come down. The record of technology is the more you spend working on it, the costs get cheaper, the performance improves, problems get resolved. So I remain optimistic about this. And I think in general, we're looking at today at the order of, say, $200 or $300 a ton, and I expect those costs will drop to below $100 a ton within the next 15 or 20 years. I do want to add one last thought, and thank you for offering, David. I wanted to note that and congratulate actually Manabe-san, the Nobel Prize winning physicist who's done all the climate models and was rewarded today with the Nobel laureate. And I mention that because I had the honor of hearing him speak almost 30 years ago at JPL, where we were doing climate talks. And he used then a word that he used a lot today, which is fun. He thought it was fun to work on climate. He thought it was fun to solve these problems. And I think what we're talking about here with negative emissions technologies is fun too. And so we should be happy about the work we do because it makes us happy.
Well, Dr. Friedman, that is a great way to end this session. I want to thank everybody behind the scenes who helped make it possible, especially the team at the ICEF Secretariat for helping us pull this together. Please join me in thanking our superb speakers for their excellent contributions. And now I'll hand it back to the moderator.